I am also a member of the HKS Fund Executive Council. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our second faculty panel of the day. And I just want to say on a personal note how honored I am to be here as an alum introducing a panel at the forum, having been in the audience in your seats for so many events here. So it is truly an honor. For today's panel, we have a very exciting discussion on the 2024 US elections, featuring democracy, AI, and the Infodemic, with professors Archon Fung, Nancy Gibbs, and Jim Waldo. Unfortunately, LaTanya Sweeney had a family emergency and is unable to join us today. Our moderator for this discussion is Archon Fung. He is the Winthrop, Laflin, McCormack Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Fung's research explores policies, practices, and institutional designs that deepen the quality of democratic governance. He focuses upon public participation, deliberation, and transparency, and co-directs the transparency policy projects, as well as leads democratic governance programs of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. Professor Fung's books include Full Disclosure, The Perils and Promise of Transparency, and Empowered Participation, Reinventing Urban Democracy. He has authored 5 books, 4 edited collections, and over 50 articles appearing in professional journals. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished group of speakers for this timely discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that kind introduction, and thank you everyone for traveling from near, but most of you from very far, to participate in this weekend's reunion events and this afternoon's panel on the 2024 election. First of all, I owe everyone an apology. As Alexandra explained, I've been working on democracy for a very long time and don't seem to have made much progress, and indeed things seem to be getting worse rather than better, so I'm very sorry. But I think my two colleagues here can help us out with that problem, at least understanding it and hopefully shedding some light on how to make progress. I'm delighted to be joined by 2 friends and colleagues. First off is Nancy Gibbs. To my left, Nancy is the director of the Shorenstein Center for Media and Politics and the Edward R. Murrow Professor of the Practice of Media and Politics. Before that, she was, for many years, the editor-in-chief of Time magazine and has the very distinguished honor of having published more articles than any other journalist in Time magazine. As punishment for being such a good friend of mine, I often inflict my poorly reasoned and poorly written writing on Nancy, and she very patiently tries to edge me a little bit forward on that. So thank you very much, Nancy. We also have
fake news this early.
Fake news. Jim Waldo, who is the Gordon McKay Professor of Practice of Computer Science. Jim is the hardest working person at Harvard University because he has 3 jobs. Not only is he a Professor of Practice of Computer Science at SEAS, he's also the Chief Technology Officer for that sizable school, and also a Professor of Practice who teaches many courses in technology and politics and policy here at the Kennedy School. So please welcome Nancy and Jim. So we'll begin the discussion here at a pretty high level. Election 2024, some people are saying democracy is on the ballot. Some people expect this election to be very different. Nancy, you've covered many elections as a journalist and as a managing editor managing many journalists. Does this election feel different, or is it pretty much like many of the other very important elections that you've covered in American history?
everything from polling models to pundit muscles actually are built by what has come before and the memory and experience of and scar tissue from past elections that we've covered. And I think that is one of the things that actually makes this election, all the elections in which Donald Trump has been a candidate, but this one in particular, uniquely challenging. If you think about it, we have the two oldest candidates ever. We have two candidates who both have 100% name recognition. We have the first rematch since 1888. We have the first candidate, I'm assuming that both parties nominate the candidates that we expect. So first candidate under criminal indictment standing trial that we have ever seen. The first major party candidate whose own vice president and multiple cabinet members are refusing to endorse or are actively opposing. And that's even before we get to the information environment and what it means to be in the first post-Roe election. 70% of voters have never voted when inflation was above 3 or 4%. Right? Like the economic environment we are living in is completely unfamiliar to a very large percentage of voters who expect and want prices to come down as opposed to go up less quickly. And so there are, and this, again, I should note, all of these unprecedented things come after we ran an election 4 years ago that had record voter turnout, took place during a pandemic, involved, again, a set of so many unprecedented things. So we don't know, once norms and traditions have been shattered, whether they ever come back. Like, will the Iowa caucuses ever come back? We don't know. Will the Presidential Debates Commission ever come back? We don't know. But we keep on confronting situations and circumstances for which there is no precedent. And I think that poses a particular challenge to people who are in the prediction business, which is why one of my strongest principles for journalists is you shouldn't be in the prediction business to begin with. Just, if there's plenty to write about things that are actually happening without writing about things that haven't happened yet.
Very good. So you covered a lot of issues that are not top of line on the headlines that are very different, like the inflation environment and some other factors. One factor that has been received a lot of attention, scholarly as well as public discussion, is this will be the first AI election where large language models are available. And we can have a discussion about the different kinds of AI, but I think large language models are the thing that is new now that wasn't present or available very much in 2020. How much will the availability of AI to campaigns and to other kinds of strategic actors affect the election? Are you worried, Jim?
So I'm curious, more than worried. The large language models are these statistical mechanisms that allow us to generate human-like speech. And there are all sorts of ways they can be used, some good, some bad. We will see how they're used. I am probably less worried than some of my colleagues, because the main worry that I've heard is the generation of deep fakes by this, lots of language or images. I think experience shows us that fakes don't need to be deep to be persuasive in the political atmosphere that we're in. Slowing down the video of Nancy Pelosi convinced a lot of people she was drinking way too much. If I'd had her job, I would have think she'd been drinking way too little. So all of these things that people are sort of hyperventilating about, I think are probably not that big a worry. I think what is going to be interesting to watch is how much data-driven, how data-driven the campaigns are going to be and how effective that is. Because what What the AI techniques in general allow us to do is to synthesize much larger chunks of data than we've ever been able to synthesize before. And so in that way, they can be predictive. But I think it's really hard to predict these elections because they don't happen very often. And it's, I will point out, 8 years ago, 2016, I had a group of students. We were trying to do predictive work on watching the political tweets, back when there were tweets instead of X's. And we started with the primary elections, but we had a lot of data, so we decided we'd keep going with the final election. We spent the last 2 weeks before the election looking for bugs in our code, because everything that we had showed that Trump was going to win, and we knew that wasn't going to happen. Yeah, the day after the election, we had a group meeting, and I said, well, the good news is we don't have to find the bug. It was the only good news we had.
Yeah.
The problem is getting the, understanding what is signal and what is noise in both the data coming in and also the data that's going out. And I think that's going to be much more interesting from the technology point of view on the current election than the use of GPTs, at least for the generation of fake content.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think curiosity is a good attitude to have. So we're already, as some people may know, in this year, I think most of the people in the world will vote for some political candidate at the national level. It's a big, big year of elections. And it is already, we've already seen the deployment of artificial intelligence in campaigns. So there was a voice deep fake of Joe Biden in the New Hampshire primaries. That it was a Joe Biden robocall that urged people not to vote in the primary. And the gist of it was, save your vote for the general election. Don't vote in the primary. So that's case one. Case two is Shemaine Daniels, who is a candidate for Congress in Pennsylvania, deployed an AI campaign fundraiser that was a voice to raise money that was robocalling for her. And then anybody from Pakistan in the audience? So you'll correct me. I'm sure I'm getting the details wrong, but my understanding is that the party formation that won the plurality in this most recent election was the Independents. And the leader of that party was Imran Khan, a very prominent cricket player who had high name recognition. Trouble was he could not himself campaign because he was imprisoned, but his supporters developed both a campaign speech based on his voice in AI, and then later on a victory speech that his AI was able to deliver. And so curiosity is right, because that's not deepfake. That's some other political effort, which may be quite positive if you think that people who are imprisoned, political prisoners, should be able to participate in politics.
We may find out ourselves.
And we may find out. Excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, so we've already opened the door a little bit to the information environment and how we're doing and what's happened and what will happen. Nancy, as a managing editor, how would you rate the political journalists of the nation so far in covering election 2024? What have they broadly done well, and what would you like to see covered slightly differently?
You know, as you all know, one of the great things about being here is the ability to, bring people to campus and in open sessions like this. And can I say how exciting it is for all of us who do lots and lots of events in this forum to see this kind of group, and also do very small closed-door things. So I brought a bunch of the top political reporters and top media reporters to campus in December to talk about coverage in a sort of group therapy session. It's like, we know this is going to be hard. We know that you're under fire from all sides. And in fact, I would say that the criticism of political coverage right now is coming every bit as fast and furious from the left as from the right. Like, we're accustomed to criticism from the right about liberal media bias. Huge amount of criticism from the left about false equivalency, both sidesism. The New York Times particularly has been, barbecued about the way they've been covering things. And so, maybe that's a sign that they're getting it right if they're getting lots of criticism from lots of perspectives. I think that it is true that the impulse and all of the incentives around covering campaigns as sport and the problems with horse race coverage, which have been exhaustively detailed, that still exists. It is still true. It is a strange thing that we cover politics, and by say we, I was a political reporter for many years, as though we write for a trade journal, where we're writing as industry insiders for industry insiders who are every bit as obsessed about what has happened in the last hour or day, which is not where most people live, and it's not the information that most people need. And so I don't think it is an accident that we are living in an age of news avoidance, where the statistics about the number of people who are tuning out from news sources because they say, I feel like it makes me angry, it makes me feel helpless or depressed, it feels manipulative, like all the ways it's trying to engage me or trying to activate me. Lots and lots of reasons, lots of competition for people's attention. But I think one of the reasons for news avoidance is if people don't find the news relevant and useful to them, if it doesn't help them understand something better, do something better, then that's a rational value calculation. And I think that the challenge for political reporters is not to write for each other, but to start with the demand, start with the audience. What is it that voters need to know? What is it that citizens and people living in a community need to know about the election in order to make good decisions as voters, to make good decisions as parents, as employers, as employees, as community members? And so I feel like there is a very active conversation going on within newsrooms about these decisions of who we are writing for, particularly as the business model depends much more on revenue from your audience, because the advertising model has collapsed. So the more dependent you are on your revenue from your audience, you need to pay attention if they stop watching and reading. And so I'm hoping that we are going to see a more responsive press through this cycle. I'm hoping that focusing not just on who won the day or who won the week or what's the strategy behind the scenes, of actually a focus on what is it that each of these candidates is saying they would do if they were to, in each case, be given a second term. It's tricky right now when President Trump is on trial, because obviously that's a huge news story. You can't pretend that it's not. It's also a very backward-looking news story that is largely about things that people already know. And so we are seeing efforts to focus more on what would a second Biden term look like, focus on, what would a second Trump term look like and focus on, who would be the people around them who would be most influential, what would be their legislative priorities. And all of that information, which is basically what would this mean for me as a voter, is much more valuable and relevant than what the latest New York Times Siena poll that has, is causing aneurysms in blue zip codes around the country has just reported.
Right, good. I want to revisit maybe the extraordinary nature of the 2024 election and tie it into news coverage. So a couple of things that strike me as quite different about this election, which are pretty far in the background. One, right now, according to opinion polls, about 3 or 4 out of 10 Americans do not believe that Joe Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. And so this is, I think, to my memory, the first election in which there's just been that level of doubt about the integrity of the apparatus itself. And a second change, which is a little harder to quantify, is I think that the political culture is becoming much more coarse in terms of the toleration and even endorsement of violence to achieve political ends. And one sees this on both the left and the right. The most visible form of that is if you talk to any election administrator, from Secretary of State on down to county clerk, everyone that I've talked to has suffered either direct kind of verbal threats or on social media or other kinds of attacks on them and their families. And then even at the Kennedy School, I think it's changed quite a bit even since the last 5-year reunion class. I am the faculty director of the Ash Center over in 124. And last week we did an active shooter training and installed panic buttons on the common spaces and under the desks of a couple faculty members because they've received direct threats from things that they've said. And so I think the level of violence is another kind of factor. And I'm saying that as background to ask a political coverage question. Maria Ressa is the commencement speaker who will speak on Thursday. People should watch her speech. We'll stream it on, or I won't, but Harvard University will on the YouTube channel. She won the Nobel Prize in 2021 for defending freedom of expression. She ran CNN news desk for Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, and then later a very important news organization called The Rappler. And I've been reading her book, and she was persecuted and imprisoned for a time by the Duterte administration in the Philippines. And I read her book as a shift. There's a period in which she's acting as a journalist, writing news for people in a democracy. And then at some point, after the first years of the Duterte administration, she's writing as a journalist defending democracy. And I think those are two slightly different attitudes. And so what would you think if I were to urge writers at the New York Times and the Washington Post and Politico to write more as journalists defending democracy rather than trying to inform citizens in a democracy? Would you say, no, you do not do that because, first of all, it's a hyperbolic threat and that runs the risk of biased coverage? Or would you say, no, it is time to do that because we're in a very different environment and you can't write like it was 1990 or 2000 or 2010?
So as you can imagine, this is a question that is actively engaging people in newsrooms, and they have very, very strong disagreements about this. And it is not because there are journalists who think that it doesn't matter whether democracy survives or not. It's not indifference to the health of democracy. It is what is most likely to sustain and contribute to the survival of democracy. And that's an important distinction, because there will be those who say that if you believe, as most journalists do, that a healthy society needs a healthy information environment, that there's a reason why the founders protected the free press among all industries, the one constitutionally protected industry is the free press, that a free press that goes about its work well and responsibly is essential to a healthy society and a healthy democracy. If you believe that, then arguably anything that undermines the press undermines democracy. And there are those who
I agree with that 100%.
Okay. So at that, so we don't, if we don't have a lot of disagreement there, where the disagreement comes in is that if a journalist goes into an interview with a political candidate with any mindset, any frame, other than trying to find out as much as they can about what that candidate believes, prioritizes, thinks. If instead they are thinking, how might this interview help or hurt this candidate because I believe this candidate is the one who is more invested in the health of democracy than the other. Now you are operating in a gray area where the perception of bias or the perception that journalists are filtering their coverage and hedging their questions or amplifying or suppressing stories depending on who they think it will help or hurt, even if all in the name of helping democracy, that has the effect of undermining trust in the press, which brings us back full circle. You undermine the press, you undermine democracy. And that's why I think that there is this fight going on. And I have had, very esteemed, very responsible, principled journalists who are very concerned with the idea of that the journalists, not just whether it's their mission, it's even whether it's their power. It's like, it's the job of voters to save democracy. We don't have that power, we don't have that ability. Our ability and our power is to equip people with the best information we can. one of the reasons why people lose trust in the press is if they think the press has lost trust in them and is withholding information because they don't trust readers with what you'll do with that. And so this is why it can seem so obvious. Well, of course the press in a democracy wants to support democracy, and what's so hard about that? There are reasons why these arguments get pretty intensive among people for whom they are making decisions every day about their coverage.
Yeah. Very good. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions about that point. I think people in the room probably have just like people in newsrooms have different perspectives on that. You know, Jim, I wanted to press you a little bit on the curiosity point and see whether, how would you respond to people who feel much more alarm about the possibility of large language models, deep fakes, and polluting the information environment? And I think the case has two pieces, right? One is that the possibility of creating images and videos of things that just flatly didn't happen, the costs of doing that have gone down a lot, almost trivial. Anyone can do it in their basement now, whereas maybe before you had to have a movie studio or something. So that's point one. And then another capability that Josh, interesting conversation between Josh Hawley and Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, in the Senate hearings revealed Altman was particularly worried about the capability of generating machine conversations with people in a one-on-one ongoing way, which campaigns can't easily do right now, right? They blast all of us like, I got 5 messages before coming out to do this event for asking me for $7 for this, that, or the other candidate. But those are the same messages that probably 1,000 other people get. But LLMs can tailor their messages to me and to Nancy and to you and to each of us, exercising maybe a greater degree of persuasion. And then the third piece that the kind of more alarmist point of view would I think they would raise is that all of this can happen just at much, much larger scale than it did in 2020. And so that's why you should be very worried, is that the noise generation is much more intense and it's far more easily spread because it's cheaper. And so we should have a hair on fire kind of attitude.
So I agree with much of that, but not all. I don't think that the advances in AI are making a change in kind here. That it is a change in degree. But for at least the last 4 candidate cycles, the notion that you will try out a message, do A/B testing by sending it out to some percentage of your mailing list, see what the responses are, and this was pioneered by the Obama campaign the first time around. So that sort of thing has been happening. The fine-tuned targeting of people was part of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now the claim was that was way more effective than it looks like the evidence supports. But certainly the statistical mechanisms and the ability of the AIs to be able to generate these messages, these images, that's changing the scale and the ease with which you could do this. Now I think there are also positive aspects to this. I could easily imagine a campaign putting together a chatbot that you could engage with directly to tell you about how the candidate is going to react in certain issues. So in the same way that we now have canvassers go door to door, you could call in and talk about your concerns and have a chatbot trained on, say, the platform of a particular party, assuming it has one, that can then talk to you about what the policy implications would be. I think that would be a good thing.
That would be a positive contribution.
Yeah. So this can work both ways.
Yeah.
And I did want to sort of follow up on Nancy's discussion last, because it's an indication of how I think these chatbots can be used for good. One of our students over in the engineering school, for her senior thesis, she had also been a journalist on the Crimson, She built a chatbot that was trained on the Newspaper Guild ethics principles that would act as an automated editor for a reporter to submit his or her story to the editor, and it would come back and point out which terms were loaded and might be not seen as ethically neutral in the story that was being written by the reporter. It was a fascinating piece of work.
That's great. That's a great example.
That she then tested on both student and professional journalists. And they all said, yeah, this would actually be useful. So we tend to be afraid of how the technology could work and not think about the positive ways it could work. Now, I'm sounding like Sam Altman here, and I don't want to sound like that. For one thing, I don't have his money. But there are dangers, but there are also positive uses that I think are at least as likely, if not more likely, to be seen.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody hyperventilates about the robocalls about Joe Biden saying don't vote. Those were discovered instantaneously.
Yes.
Nobody was fooled by that.
And people were fined because of it. Yeah.
So is the bigger problem, though, imagine a deepfake video of either Donald Trump or Joe Biden or any candidate doing something horrible.
Really horrible, like.
Even if it is.
Oh, never mind.
No, don't go there.
Seems to only work with one of them, but go ahead.
Even if it were immediately debunked or identified, you can't unsee it.
So.
And I wonder if that is, if the thing, and it's even different than a robocall, like the power of the visual image.
Visual images are way more powerful than spoken stuff. And again, I learn everything I know from my students. We had a great thesis a couple of years ago from a student who was joint CS in philosophy, looking at the epistemic power of fake images. And they really do hit the brain differently. My one consolation on these is that most of the images that get generated, even by the really good, the really good image generators, are not yet quite good enough to be to not be detectable. You know, the hands are bad. You have to know what you're looking for, but you know, I think these are going to convince people who are already convinced. I think it's going to be very hard to convince people who are in the middle rapidly enough, especially if these can be debunked rapidly. And certainly, you know, we at the Shorenstein Center, we have some projects to try to give you a notion of a chain of trust on images and other such things. But those are technologies we're just beginning to work on. I think they're important because I think images are going to be different as they get better.
Nancy, I remember in the run-up to the 2020 election, we had some conversations, and you were telling me about how there were conversations in newsrooms preparing journalists to explain on election night that the results that you get a couple hours after polls close may shift as the night goes on and in subsequent days because of mail-in ballots and the proportion of people who are R's and D's vote that get their ballots counted early may be slightly different from later on. And I thought that was a very positive thing, is educating the public about what to expect on election night and afterwards. We haven't followed up on that, and I don't know. So two questions, one backward looking and one forward looking. Was there discussion about how to cover election meltdown at that point? Because certainly I thought, and many of my colleagues thought, if Donald Trump had lost the election, there would be a pretty good chance that there would be a little bit of bumpiness in the peaceful transfer of power, so to speak. And so then that's the backward-looking question, was there? And then the forward-looking question is, are newsrooms having conversations about how to cover election meltdown possibilities going forward in 2024?
So there was, many of you will remember all of the discussion of the red mirage.
Yeah.
And that of a real awareness, because we were holding an election during a pandemic, that we were going to have vastly higher levels of early voting and mail-in voting, and because every state makes its own rules about whether you can even open the mail-in ballots before Election Day or not, that it lent itself to dramatic changes in, even though everyone knew that, everyone talked about it, everyone tried to prepare internally and externally for it. If you remember watching the live coverage on election night, even the anchors themselves had trouble remembering
That conversation.
that conversation. And then famously, a few days after, when the race had been called and certified and President Trump was still resisting accepting the outcome, there was the now infamous quote that I wonder if we will ever identify the speaker to the Washington Post of, "What harm does it do to humor him for a little while?"
Oh,
And
I guess we know the answer to that question.
and what we've all learned, and certainly newsrooms, but legal scholars, election workers, secretaries of state, the whole infrastructure of elections. It was like 2020 was the year we watched the Raptors testing the fences. And we saw the weak parts. We saw about the incredible importance that the vice president plays in accepting the slate of electors. I think we all had an incredible crash course in the actual intricacies of the process whereby electors are selected and certified and accepted through this process with these critical dates in November, in December, and fatefully January 6th. So yes, we know more, and yes, a lot of effort has been made from the Electoral Count Act and efforts to harden our infrastructure. I don't think you'd have to be really optimistic to think that we have fully secured all of the weak spots. And the reason I know this is because you scared the bejesus out of the Shorenstein board when you helped us think through all of the entirely legal ways that the outcome of an election could not end up being the person who got the most, not just the most votes, popular votes, but even the most electoral college votes. So maybe you want to scare our alums. But I think this truly, we now know, is not just an intellectual exercise. It is important that we understand where our institutions leave room for unexpected things to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people are quite concerned about the possibility of electoral ricketiness in 2024. And so there's, all of the risky scenarios are premised on a close election. That is, an election in which doubt could be cast, reasonable or quasi-reasonable doubt on who actually got the most votes in any particular state. And it's remarkable that most of the elections since the Bush-Gore contest in 2000, with a few exceptions, have been decided by a very small margin. So in 2020, if I think 40,000 of the right voters had voted a different way, a different person would be president. And 2020 was actually closer on that dimension than 2016, remarkable. And so we've kind of gotten to this political configuration in which every election, because of this weird institution called the Electoral College, is on a knife's edge. So that's like the first fact, and there's, I think, a pretty good chance that 2024 will be close enough. So that's the first kind of enabling condition. If it's not close in that way, then there's no election meltdown, for sure, right? But if it is close in that way, then the features of the Electoral College create a lot of vulnerability for bad actors to try to get a different outcome other than the one that they, whatever the majority or Electoral College winner, as most people counting the votes think. And in 2020, it took the form of an idea articulated by John Eastman, White House advisor, among others, to alter the counting of the Electoral College votes in Congress. That is, to flip a slate so that slates from some states that would have gone to Biden would instead go to Trump. The Electoral Count Reform Act has plugged a lot of those holes, but still it can't plug all of them. And if you want to read about the many vulnerabilities, there's a recent book by my colleague Larry Lessig and Matthew Seligman called How to Steal a Presidential Election. And what they're most worried about is the rogue governor problem. So say you have a governor in Florida or North Carolina or Wisconsin that all the votes in that state have been counted. They go to candidate A, but the governor prefers candidate B. And the margin is small enough so that the governor just says, I'm going to certify a different slate for candidate B rather than candidate A. And there would be a bunch of court fights about that. But the architecture of federalism is such that that Congress's only job is to count up the electoral slates that the states have sent up. Congress is not a recount authority in that regard, right? So that remains a huge, huge vulnerability in the system that people should look out for. You know, one thing that journalists might do to prepare for this, Larry writes about this in his book, is that in the coverage of the 2020 election, journalists largely failed to point out what Congress's role legally is, which is just to count up the slate. So several senators arguing for the voter fraud case were saying, look, we're not going to take these slates because there was voter fraud in Georgia or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or wherever it was. But the law is, and the senators very much know this, their job is not to determine whether the votes were properly counted in X, Y, or Z state, but only whether the electors sent to Congress were legally sent to Congress. And so Larry makes a big deal out of, well, this created a lot of room for bad faith in our political class. They absolutely knew that they were breaking the law in elections. They just didn't care. So another enabling condition is you have to have politicians who actually want to follow the laws of elections for the laws to matter. Okay. So every time I've done a talk about democracy, it's ended on a down note. So I'm trying very, very hard to change that. So I want to ask Jim and then Nancy suggestions for how to make things better. And Jim, you might think they don't need any suggestions because it's not that bad with regard to AI and deepfakes. But if you, what one or two changes, either to what companies are doing, what campaigns are doing, what technologists are building, what regulators ought to do, would you recommend to make democracy more resilient to some of the problems that AI is introducing?
Well, I do have a lot of sympathy for the movement to make use of AI, especially in campaigns, way more transparent. I also worry about the ability of foreign actors to use AI to give much more convincing, to sound much more convincing than they now do, because the translation is going to be so much better. So I'm not a complete Pollyanna on this. I don't think everything is great. I think transparency is going to be necessary. I think, again, there are positive uses, but I think there are also huge negative possibilities that really the technologists have to take responsibility for. I am not a technologist who believes that technology is ethically neutral. I think there are decisions on what should be shipped and what should not be shipped that should be made in thoughtful ways. And finding mechanisms that will require that be done by the people developing these technologies, I think is absolutely necessary. And it's not just for elections, it's for everything else. I guess the reason I feel I sounded sunnier than maybe I am at the beginning is I don't think the problems around AI are particular to democracy. I think the problems around AI are particular to AI.
Yeah.
And they filter through everything. And democracy and elections just happens to be one that is pretty important and is coming up pretty soon. And so it might be a useful forcing function to decide on how we do this governance, but it's not the only reason to do it.
Very good, thank you.
That was supposed to be the cheerful part?
Well, I think the cheerful part is we can do it.
Yeah. Some states have required disclosure.
And I believe we should. And so, one of the things I have found most interesting over the last 5 or 6 years is, those of you that read my background will see that my formal training was actually as a philosopher, not as a computer scientist. And so I've been teaching technology ethics for the last 15 years. For the first 10 years of that, I was sort of considered an oddball. Why would you do anything like that? It's no longer considered odd. We are, and if anything, this is the kind of thing that Harvard can do better than any other spot, is that we can teach our technologists that they have a moral obligation to the society and to each other, because we are a liberal arts institution. And I think that differentiates us from, say, the Votech down the river or some other schools that will allow them to make more reasonable decisions when it comes to that. And that, I think, is the ultimate optimism that I have.
Thank you very much. Nancy, 1 or 2 changes, either long or short term, that would improve the news environment?
So, local news is often called democracy's immune system. And so I am encouraged by the awareness that people have in how important it is that losing 2 newspapers a week in this country is unsustainable. Hollowing out our newsrooms, turning dailies into weeklies, turning newsrooms that used to employ 200 people to now have 12, half of whom are journalism interns. This is unsustainable. And so there is a very deliberate, concerted effort that is being led by big philanthropy like the MacArthur Foundation, the Knight Foundation, to almost re-educate us to think about news and local news as not as a business, not as the news industry, but as civic infrastructure.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to live in a town that didn't have a volunteer fire department. You don't want to live in a town that doesn't have a news source. And we know, and the research is abundant, that a community that loses its news doesn't have to be a newspaper. It can come in any form. But a community that does not have a reliable source of local news, public spending goes up, public corruption goes up, fewer people run for office, civic engagement goes down, bond ratings go down. Like, there are all sorts of negative impacts on the health of that community. And so I think that the act of public education, of helping people understand the role that not CNN and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal play in their community, but the most place-based news organizations, and they are critically important at election time. And so the fact that this is something we focus on at Shorenstein, it's something that big foundations are focused on, and I think the awareness that this is another critical piece of our democratic infrastructure is one that I'm very encouraged by.
Great, thank you. Before I open up for questions, I'll tell a happy story, but it occurs in the late 1940s and 1950s, so you have to go back a little ways. And so you have to go back to the last major transformation in communications technology was in the run-up to World War II. And there was radio, and there was film, and then a little bit after World War II, there would be television. And there was a great deal of anxiety in Europe and the United States and North America that these large mass communication technologies were absolutely corrosive for democracy, because Hitler, Hirohito, Mussolini had been very, very adept at using these new communication technologies to gain power and eventually start and fight World War II to a huge damaging effect to tens of millions of people. And then so after World War II in Europe and the United States, there was a conversation about how to make these mass communication technologies okay for democracy rather than bad for it. And in the United States, a linchpin of that effort was a commission called the Hutchins Commission that was funded by Henry Luce, who was the owner of Time Life magazine. Hutchins was the president of the University of Chicago. And Henry Luce thought, these jokers, they'll just say freedom of expression, we're good to go. But the Hutchins Commission came up with a much more ambitious agenda that did say that news was civic infrastructure, that said that the job of mass media was to create an account for all of America's citizens of the day's events so that they could understand what's going on and conduct themselves politically, know who to support, know who to oppose, know how to think about public affairs in a sensible way. And then furthermore, an implication of the Hutchins Commission report was that it was going to be costly because it's not easy to figure out what's true. You need a real profession of journalists devoted to that craft. And if you want a profession, you've got to really pay them money so that they can have a whole career over a lifespan in that business. And then furthermore, if a journalist writes a very damaging story about your largest advertiser, guess what? You've got to take it on the chin for democracy and run that story. There's got to be a separation between the news part and the business part. And of course, we know that those norms were often violated in the breach, but nevertheless, those principles informed a big part of what was good about professional journalism and mass media in the post-war period for many decades. And so it was the result of a social effort to say, what do we want the civic infrastructure of news to be like? And then it was a great deal of corporate social responsibility under the threat of socialization. Nobody wanted to be the BBC, right? They wanted to have their own companies. So they agreed to that kind of corporate social responsibility for the sake of democracy. And we're at the point now, I think, where the problems of the news environment are widely recognized, but that all-society effort to figure out what we want this environment to be like, what would be good, hasn't quite happened yet. And I view this conversation, and many like it, as incremental steps to nudge toward that effort. Okay, so now we'll open it up. We have some time for some questions. People probably remember the forum norms. There are microphones up to my left and right, and I can't see, but there are sometimes microphones up in the stands as well. And so 3 rules. First of all, identify yourself. Second, keep your question brief, and remember the question ends in a question mark. And the third rule is 1 per customer. Yeah, over here.
Thank you for this amazing conversation. My name is Francisco Almendra. I am a MPAD class of 2009. I'm from Brazil. And my question is, we've been hearing a lot in the conversation today about mass media and to some degree social media. And like the impacts of AI and fake news and fake narratives on those 2 levels, right? Coming from Brazil, what has happened there is that social media and mainstream media are still visible. We can see what's been posted, we can react to that, we can get fact-checked, we can get traced. And there is a whole way to deal with those 2 levels.
But not
Once it
WhatsApp.
goes into WhatsApp,
Yeah.
once it goes into Telegram, once it goes into proprietary platforms that can hide behind like encryption, and they don't have access to the content, et cetera, it becomes like the dark web in the sense that you can't trace, or it's not as easy to do so, and a lot of the echo chamber thing goes onto those mediums, right? So probably happens less in the US because like WhatsApp and Telegram are not as strong here as it is in other places because they don't have free messaging, but still, it's a big problem, and it's a worldwide problem. And I wanted to get your perspective on how does the conversation that we're talking today here apply to that 3rd level, which is so prominent and is making huge difference all over the world, and I imagine to some degree in the US as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Jim thinks. I don't have an answer to that, because it's very true that we're watching the internet as we knew it, and as we grew up and watched it evolve, in a sense, dissolving and disaggregating into, and there's a certain amount of research about younger people who are spending less and less time on public social platforms and more time, and I don't even know, you may test your own behaviors, but in their family chats, in their own small group chats, and that the social web as we knew it, partly because of what is the term of art, the unshittification of just the amount of advertising, the amount of slop that is on it, that the quality of the experience on public platforms has gone down. There are lots of things that are driving people. What either governments or civil society can do to combat damaging information that is spread in encrypted, closed platforms. Jim, I don't know if you have an answer to that, because.
Well, so the answer is you can't. There's just, but there is a tension between encryption and wide distribution, right? The more you rely on encryption, the smaller the group that will be able to see it. Now, the group has to come in. They have to have the keys. You're shaking your head no. Some of these groups can get quite large, but then they have to have their own security to keep from being seen. The problem with encryption is it's out there. We have to deal with it. This genie is out of the bottle. Yeah. And there are really good uses for encryption, right? Without encryption, you will not be able to do any commerce over the World Wide Web.
Sorry, the question is not about encryption here. Like, I just wanted to keep our focus here. It's not about encryption and the positive uses for it. What I'm saying is the whole conversation, the fake news spreading, and the AI, like pernicious aspect from it, has gone to these messaging apps. That's a fact. Yeah. So how do we deal with that? Yeah.
I think
like, irrespective of the positive sides of encryption.
I mean, I think the most profound version of this is that it's really two-sided in that. So let me just, a little story. Larry Lessig, my friend, bought this deliberation platform that allows small groups of people to deliberate, and we had this idea that maybe we should field it in Harvard College, and groups of 8 undergraduates could talk about a controversial issue like the war in Gaza and come to understand each other more and deliberate. And I showed it to an undergraduate, happens to be my son, and he said, this is an okay idea, but you'd have to anonymize it because people would dox each other and they would be afraid to say things. Mm-hmm. And so that is like mind-blowing, because I think the Larry platform version is a version of what is happening society-wide, in that we're too public and we're afraid of the consequences for employment or for status or for whatever of just sharing things with one another. Brandeis said in 1890 that the reason that privacy is important is because unless you have privacy, you can't think through anything in a candid way, and you become less of a person and less thoughtful. And so the positive side of the WhatsApp thing is that it allows people to really express themselves. The downside is that you can't regulate and combat fake news. And I think that is a really, really deep tension that I think we've only just begun to grapple with at this point.
Well, and in fact, there are multiple dimensions of this, because there is privacy, which is different from anonymity. There is confidentiality, and there is all of the technology that is out there anyway. So going to a completely open and transparent society is not going to be possible. So how do we deal with all of these technologies? This, by the way, is a much harder problem than AI and democracy, and one that this is actually what I work on full-time. So I understand your question better now, and I'm going to give you the answer that I give all my students, which is it depends, and it's hard. And we don't have the answer yet, but we need one.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I'm Bhakti Merchandani. I was an MPA, MBA in 2005, but I feel like I'm 2004, which is why I'm here. You've spoken about kind of the hollowing out of the news, the hollowing out of the internet, and mentioned things like the Hutchinson Commission. We could look at Biden's blueprint. But what is an investor to do? I've been in kind of settings where investors and entrepreneurs are just kind of racing to improve their product, and it's kind of a race of the amount of money they have to spend and beating competition. What incentives, other than not wanting to destroy the world that we live in, would be effective to get the private sector to act in a way that would be helpful for our long-term interests? What have you seen that would work?
I don't know if that's a question for the philosopher or for the,
I think it's the business model question.
Sounds like the journalist to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that, and I cannot speak authoritatively on this, but the ghost I feel haunting all of the discussions around the race to invest and to build in the gold rush that is AI is what happened with the platforms and the failure to create the guardrails, to wildly underestimate their importance. I don't think anyone is underestimating the importance of these technologies. I don't see anyone saying, oh, it's a flash in the pan or it's a lot of hype. The sheer volume of money that is going into building this infrastructure and the concentration, because only very few companies have the capital to be able to do that. It feels like this replay of a movie that we have seen before that didn't turn out very well. So I don't know what either of you make of the guidelines that Senator Schumer released this week that was sort of not legislation, but a roadmap towards legislation. Suggests to me that regulators here are still moving very slowly and are reluctant to stifle innovation, which is always, the subtext. And so I think that we're more likely to see answers coming from Europe, which has been true on the platforms as well. And I don't expect it to necessarily come from within industry itself. I think it's going to be imposed from outside, but not starting with the United States Congress. That's my best guess, but as I say.
Yeah, I really agree. I think one starting point is to question an assumption of whether we want a fast pace of innovation and whether that's always a good thing. A friend of mine says, well, without the FDA, drug innovation would be enormously more rapid. We'd have new drugs all the time. Do we want that exactly? I don't know. And so I think, obviously the technology analogy is just straightforward that way. And then I do think I would like to see some very blunt regulation. How about the large platforms pay 1% for information, the fact tax, and then create a pooled fund to fund local news that Nancy very much wants? I'd love to see that. That doesn't take a genius. It just takes some political will. And then what is more constructive are things like the EU AI Act, which is very far ahead of what the US is doing. And for people interested in AI regulation, I'd have a good look at that. They have risk categories. So some uses of AI are just banned, right? That are super high risk uses like social credit scoring. And then there's some high risk, very high risk categories like election participation and things that could affect people's employment. And then there are low risk categories like games and stuff like that. And then you get different levels of scrutiny depending on how risky the risk application of your artificial intelligence application is.
Well, but
yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So there's got to be the technologist in here saying, wait a second. So wait a second. I think, back in the early days of the AIDS crisis, we did want the FDA to move faster. And in fact, a lot of people died because the FDA did not move faster, and because of those regulations, and because of the care that they took. So this is a balancing act.
Yeah.
And this is not an either or, this is a balancing act. I'll go back to somebody who asked the question, because you got the MBA. A lot of it depends on what the business models are going to be. And if the business model is that we're going to have unbridled innovation and that's where you get the money, then that's going to be a problem, right? If the business model for newspapers is based on classified ads and those disappear because of the internet, we need to find another business model, whether it be civic engagement, taxes, or whatever. We haven't done that kind of work. So let's not think that slowing things down is always going to be the right thing, because it's not. We're not the only players in this game.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Harut Manugian. I'm a MPA graduate of 2019. My question is, in your opinion, what are the conditions that an independent or third-party candidate would have to meet in order to earn a spot on the presidential debate stage?
So I think CNN is
For somebody
saying
who's done debates.
that 15% in 4 polls and a reasonable likelihood of being on the ballots in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes. I think that's, I'm doing that from memory, but I think what is a reasonable threshold is I want to say an academic question. What we have seen, you may have been surprised at how quickly these debates sort of came together, which makes me think there were a lot of conversations happening quietly. And among the things that they may have agreed on was both parties do not think it is in their interest for RFK Jr. to be on the stage. And so whatever rules ABC or CNN or Fox make about third-party candidates, the only way they're going to have the 2 major party candidates on the stage is if those campaigns agree. And so in a sense, it is an academic question about what it should be versus what it will be. And I would be very surprised to see any other candidates on the debate stage.
Because of the deal that Team Trump and Team Biden have just made.
I mean, I think what's a little unusual is they are both calculating that this could be bad for them. Normally, it's pretty clear which candidate is more likely to be losing voters to a third-party candidate, which means that one candidate would love that third party on the stage and the other one doesn't. In this case, because their interests seem to be aligned, I just think that makes it way harder for him to get a place on the stage.
Yeah, there's
The simple answer to the question is actually to be nominated by one of the 2 major parties.
So there's a historical version of your question. What Trump and Biden just did is what happened over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. That is, in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States, there were many political parties, and then the 2 major parties erected many, many barriers to entry at the state level to make sure that there are only 2 parties competing. And so the debate deal is a micro version of a long effort to lock in a duopoly to prevent third and fourth parties from competing. And there's lots and lots of rules that make it very difficult to be a successful third or fourth party candidate. And we didn't get time to talk about institutional reforms, but I am very much in favor of moving beyond a 2-party system. The United States and Hungary are the only 2 modern democracies with 2 effective parties. And I think that the polarization in the United States that we're seeing has a lot of different causes, but one of them is the 2-party system. There are only 2 teams you can be on right now. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Brian Collette. I'm a MPP 1999. I live in a congressional district in Florida that some might argue is a highly gerrymandered district. And I saw the evidence of that. We've had some uncontested elections. In Florida law, you don't even get to vote for Congress if it's uncontested. So I was kind of surprised when I was reading American history to find out that James Madison had as his first amendment in the Bill of Rights was the Congressional Apportionment Act, which passed but was not ratified by one state, and I think it was the Connecticut upper house that failed to ratify it. But in that act, he called for a maximum of 40,000 people, I believe, per congressperson. So my question is, do you think America would have a better democracy if we had a more direct democracy with 10,000 representatives? And given the fact that we've had the same number of representatives for 100 years, we haven't updated the Congress even though our population's quadrupled in that 100 years. And similarly, we haven't updated the rules for the Senate in over 100 years, even though we're approaching the fact where Texas and California combined will have 100 million people and only 4 senators. So given all that, do you think it's time to upgrade the way we elect Congress and Senate?
You just hit Archon's sweet spot.
Stand back.
Institutional reform.
Yeah. I don't know about the expanding the House question. You know, one thing that often very well-informed audiences like this one do not know is that it's actually unconstitutional for any U.S. state to have a legislative structure that resembles the U.S. Senate. That is, lots of states used to have an upper house in which it was kind of like the U.S. Senate, in which a county, you know, each county would get a representative. And then in a couple of Supreme Court decisions in, I think the late 1960s or 1970s, Reynolds v. Sims, and another one, the justices decided that that was unconstitutional because representatives represent people, not trees, not empty acres of grass, but people. And then so if that's true, you might ask, well, how can it be that the U.S. Senate is constitutional if you can't reproduce that at any state level? And the justices said, well, that's different because the United States is a compact between 13 colonies. And so because of that pact, that's why the U.S. Senate with its current structure is justified, right? So it's a historical argument, which is not about political equality. It obviously is a huge violation of political equality. And so I think we could debate about whether we should honor the Senate because of this pact between 13 separate colonies. Most of the states, obviously, were not party to that pact. Things have moved along. So I would very much favor upper house Senate reform because it violates the principle of equal representation, for sure. I'm afraid we're out of time now. Thank you. But I will be staying a few more minutes, and then Nancy and Jim will as well. And then I believe Betsy told me that we're having a reception under the tent outside. So if you just go out those doors to the graduation tent, we'll be able to chat informally. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We're getting close to the end of the day. As Archon said, you can now head over to JFK Park tent for an evening reception. Info for your class dinners can be found in Huva. Thank you all for another wonderful